As senior leaders, everything you do will be closely watched, and I am not immune. As many of you saw, the result of the photograph of me at Lafayette Square last week, that sparked a national debate about the role of the military in civil society. I should not have been there. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. As a commissioned, uniformed officer, it was a mistake that I have learned from.
That's
the
boy,
chair.
Yeah.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, with that apology for his role in the president's controversial June 1st photo op in front of St. John's Church. Joining us now, Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Democratic Congressman Anthony Brown of Maryland. He's a veteran of the Iraq War and a recipient of the Bronze Star.
Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I know you understand the culture of the military extremely well. And I'm curious what your thoughts are hearing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying to everybody in the military, I, too, am accountable. I should not have been there. It was a mistake. How important was that message for the general to send out? And what do you think the positive outcome of that will be in the long run?
Well, good morning, Joe and Mika. Thanks for having me on. I think it was a very important statement that General Milley made. And it could have been avoided because the circumstances underlying the need for the statement was avoidable. And I attribute that in large part to the fact that President Trump simply doesn't understand the military. He doesn't understand the role or the relationship between America's military and America's society, how we regard our military, how they need to keep a distance from domestic politics. So while I commend General Milley for stepping up and taking responsibility, we need more leaders, both military and civilian, to do that. He never should have been in that position in the first place. He understands that. He acknowledged that. And a lot of this, though, I think lies at the feet of the commander-in-chief, who is, quite frankly, an inept commander-in-chief, and that's Donald Trump.
Well, just two questions come to mind watching that apology, which is in many ways staggering. I try to wonder, and I wonder what your concerns might be about the position this general was in the run-up to that photo op. What led to that fateful decision, really? And then the position he was in after with his peers in the military for doing it.
Sure. You know, a recounting of the events suggests that General Milley was at the White House and in Washington for a very legitimate reason, and then found himself swept up with the president as he brought an entourage to Lafayette Plaza for a photo op. Yeah. General Milley was able to avoid probably the grossest photo op, in which Secretary Esper stood by the side of President Trump, who later stood with the Bible. But General Milley understood he should not have even been in the vicinity of Lafayette Park. It does damage to the military. And his statement today, or I should say yesterday, was very important, particularly to the men and women in uniform, to remind them that we are not loyal or beholden to a president, nor the man or woman who holds that office. We are loyal to the Constitution, the values that it embodies, and this nation and the nation's people. And that's first and foremost. And I think General Milley articulated that very well in his statement yesterday.
Congressman Brown, it's Willie Geist. Great to talk to you this morning. I want to ask you about the bipartisan legislation that you have introduced to rename United States military bases that have been named for Confederate generals, Confederate leaders. I know you served some time at Fort Hood. That base is named for a lieutenant in the Confederate Army, John Bell Hood. What is your position? How do you articulate your opposition to these names, which is obvious to some people why they should be changed, but not to everyone? And just on a personal level, what it was like for you as a soldier to walk into a base knowing that it had been named for a Confederate leader who sought to maintain the institution of slavery?
Willie, I got my start at Fort Rucker, Alabama, named after a Confederate general. I jumped out of airplanes, or at least learned how to jump out of airplanes, at Fort Benning, another Confederate general. I deployed to Iraq out of Fort Bragg, and I've been to Fort Hood on countless occasions. And this is my response. No one's trying to rewrite history. You're going to hear the stories of the Confederacy and Confederate soldiers in history books. You'll see them in museums and libraries, but there's simply no need to honor the people or the symbols of an institution or individuals that defended the institution of slavery. The Army has 10 military installations. The Navy has 1 naval vessel. There are certainly countless buildings and avenues and roads on military installations that honor and pay tribute to Confederate soldiers. We can eliminate that without erasing the history of this country. By eliminating that, I think we demonstrate respect to what it means for African Americans who put on that uniform, and how the Confederacy is a symbol of hatred, racism, whose wounds continue to run deep throughout this country. So it's long overdue. I want to thank Representative Don Bacon, who served as a general in the United States Air Force, a Republican, who is a co-sponsor, a lead co-sponsor of this bill.
So I want to ask you about the push for police reform legislation that is working its way through Congress, and also the concept of defunding the police. Oscar-winning director Spike Lee is concerned that the defund the police movement will have adverse effects, with President Trump perverting the message to stoke fear. Lee told Al Roker on SiriusXM's Today Show Radio, quote, activists have to be careful with the words because already this guy is running with that. You know the guy I'm talking about, Agent Orange. And again, he's trying to twist the narrative like he did with Kaepernick and the kneeling, trying to say that was about disrespecting the flag. But that wasn't it at all. Spike Lee continued, we've got to be careful what we say because 1 or 2 wrong words, they'll twist things around, the narratives change. I don't think people are saying we don't need police at all, but defund the police. I think there could be a better terminology. What do you think?
I completely agree with Spike Lee, as do many of my colleagues, perhaps the overwhelming majority in Congress. It's not about defunding the police. It's about reimagining or transforming the police. I think we can acknowledge that racism and systemic racism pervades many, certainly, police departments across this country. And we need to transform these police departments. Could that involve restructuring? Yes. Certainly, it involves holding police accountable, and that's where the Justice in Policing Act that we introduced earlier this week goes after. It includes prohibiting certain conduct that we know is lethal and dangerous and unnecessary, like the chokehold and other neck restraints, requiring the use of body camera, empowering investigators to do pattern and practice investigations, and to reduce, if not eliminate, the barriers to prosecuting bad cops and allowing people who are harmed by bad cops to seek redress and compensation in the courts. So there are many things that we need to do. But I think we should also acknowledge that the protesters and those calling for defunding the police are certainly onto something, and that is that we need to make greater investments in the community, whether it's homelessness and poverty, whether it's addressing mental health needs that are unmet today in communities across this country, or alcohol and drug abuse and addiction treatment and counseling. These types of investments need to happen, but they can happen without defunding the police. We need to reimagine the police, transform the police, but certainly we need the police not as warriors in the community, but as protectors and guardians of the community.
Congressman Anthony Brown, thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.